The forest was still. The only sound was the crackling of the small fire outside the cabin. The boy sat silently, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames, while the woodsman sharpened his axe with steady precision. This was their life, quiet, predictable, and isolated from the chaos beyond the trees. The boy, mute since birth, had lived with the woodsman for as long as he could remember. Though he couldn't speak, his silence had always been his strength. He watched, listened, and learned through observation, developing an acute awareness of the world around him. The woodsman, a gruff but gentle man, had taught him how to survive in the wilderness, how to trap animals, forage for food, and navigate the dense forest paths that twisted like a labyrinth. The cabin, nestled deep within the forest, was their refuge. Beyond it, the kingdom was in turmoil, though neither the boy nor the woodsman cared much for the affairs of kings and nobles. Their world was confined to the trees, where the boy felt safe. Here, silence was his language, and he spoke it fluently. Occasionally, they ventured to the nearest village for supplies, though the woodsman always insisted on keeping a low profile. The boy never questioned it. He didn't need to. The woodsman's cautious nature had always been a part of their life, like the walls of the cabin that protected them from the dangers outside. But lately, the boy had felt a shift. The woodsman seemed more restless, his eyes often drifting toward the forest's edge, as if he were expecting something or someone. The boy had noticed it, too, the strange sensation that they were no longer alone. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. One night, the woodsman returned from a trip to the village with a grim expression. He didn't speak much, but the boy could sense the weight of the unsaid. They ate their dinner in silence, the crackling of the fire the only sound between them. The boy's curiosity burned, but he knew better than to press the woodsman for answers. For now, the boy kept to his routine, hunting, gathering, maintaining the cabin, but the unease lingered, like a shadow creeping along the edges of his quiet life. Something was coming. He just didn't know what. The knock came at dawn, a sound that cut through the silence like a blade, sending the boy's heart racing. The woodsman froze mid-movement, his hand gripping the handle of his axe as he exchanged a tense glance with the boy. Visitors were rare, uninvited ones even more so. The knock came again, more insistent this time. The woodsman rose, his face a mask of controlled fear, and motioned for the boy to stay back. The boy obeyed, retreating into the shadows as the woodsman approached the door. His heart pounded in his chest, his eyes wide as he watched from his hiding place. The door creaked open, revealing a man dressed in fine, dark clothes, clearly out of place in the rough surroundings of the forest. His eyes were sharp, and the air around him seemed charged with authority. The boy could sense immediately that this man was no ordinary visitor. "Good morning," the stranger said, his voice smooth but carrying an edge of command. "I believe you have something that belongs to the kingdom." The woodsman's grip on the door tightened. "You're mistaken. I live alone here." The man's smile was thin, humorless. "We both know that isn't true." From the shadows, the boy's pulse quickened. He didn't fully understand conversation, but the tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. The stranger's gaze shifted past the woodsman, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on the boy. "There he is," the man said softly. "I've come for him." The woodsman stepped forward, his body a shield between the boy and the man. "You have no claim here. Leave." The stranger's smile faded. "I'm afraid that's not your decision to make. The boy is of royal blood. His heritage cannot be hidden forever. He has a destiny beyond these woods, whether you wish it or not." The boy's mind swirled in confusion. Royal blood. He had always believed he was just an orphan, taken in by the woodsman out of charity. But now this man, this stranger, was saying otherwise. The boy felt his world tilt, the certainty of his quiet life shattering like glass. The woodsman's voice was low, dangerous. "You're not taking him." The man's eyes narrowed. "This is bigger than you. The boy is the last hope for a rebellion that could free this kingdom from tyranny. He belongs with his people, The woodsman tightened his grip on the axe, the air between them thick with the promise of violence. I said leave. For a moment, it seemed as though the man would push further, but then, with a glance at the boy, he stepped back. I'll be back, he said, his voice cold. And next time, I won't come alone. With that, he turned and disappeared into the forest, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. The woodsman closed the door, his expression unreadable. The boy looked at him, questions swirling in his mind, but the woodsman only sighed and muttered, "We need to leave." The air in the cabin felt thick after the visitor left, as though the walls themselves were closing in. The boy stood frozen, his mind racing with fragments of what had just been revealed. The woodsman, still gripping his axe, paced in front of the door, his face a mask of suppressed rage and worry. "We need to leave," the woodsman muttered again, though this time it seemed more like he was speaking to himself. He glanced at the boy, who was still standing in the shadows. "Pack your things. We're not safe here anymore." The boy didn't move at first, too overwhelmed by the stranger's words. Royal blood, a rebellion. None of it made sense. He had lived his entire life in this cabin, secluded from the world. There had never been any talk of royalty or politics. Just the forest, the woodsman, and their quiet life. The woodsman must have sensed the boy's hesitation because he stopped pacing and knelt down in front of him. His usually stern eyes softened, but there was an urgency behind them. "I'll explain everything, but first we need to move. They'll be back soon, and they'll bring more with them." The boy nodded slowly and hurried to gather his belongings, his thoughts racing. As he packed, the woodsman moved about the cabin, collecting supplies, his movements hurried but methodical. The boy knew this meant trouble. The woodsman was rarely rattled, and seeing him like this only deepened the boy's growing sense of dread. Once their things were packed, the woodsman led the boy out of the cabin and into the forest. They moved quickly through familiar paths, their feet making little sound on the forest floor. The boy's mind churned with questions, but his instincts kept him quiet. Now wasn't the time for answers. It was a time for escape. After hours of walking, they reached a small clearing deep in the woods, far from the cabin. The woodsman stopped and turned to face the boy. His face was worn, his eyes tired. He sighed deeply and motioned for the boy to sit on a fallen log. "There's a lot I never told you," the woodsman began, his voice quieter than usual. "When I found you, you were just a baby. You were left at the edge of the forest, abandoned. At the time, I thought it was just another orphan left to fend for himself. But over the years, I've learned the truth." The boy sat still, his gaze fixed on the woodsman, waiting for him to continue. "You're not just any orphan. You were born into a royal bloodline, one that the kingdom has been trying to erase. Your parents, they were leaders of a rebellion, a group that tried to overthrow the king. They were betrayed, and the rebellion was crushed. Your mother sent you into hiding to protect you from the same fate." The boy felt the world shift beneath him as the words sank in. His parents, leaders of a rebellion. His silence, normally a shield, felt like a cage now, trapping him inside his thoughts with no way to express the storm raging within him. The woodsman looked at him with regret in his eyes. "I never told you because I didn't want you to grow up with that burden. I wanted to give you a chance at a simple life. But seems the past has finally caught up with us." The boy's heart pounded in his chest. He had always felt safe with the woodsman, but now his entire life felt like a lie. Why hadn't the woodsman told him sooner? Why was he only learning the truth now, when danger was already at their doorstep? "I know this is a lot to take in," the woodsman said, his voice softening. "But you need to understand, there are people who'll stop at nothing to find you. That man who came to the cabin, he's not the last. They'll keep coming until they've forced you to fulfill whatever destiny they believe is yours." The boy stared at the ground, trying to process everything. The woodsman's words left him with more questions than answers, but he knew one thing for sure: they couldn't go back. Not now. The woodsman stood and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "We'll keep moving, and we'll stay ahead of them. But you need to stay alert. There's no telling what we'll face next." As the night fell, the woodsman and the boy made camp by a small stream. The woodsman's demeanor had changed. He was no longer the silent protector, but a man burdened by the weight of past secrets. The boy, for the first time in his life, felt adrift, unsure of who he really was or what his future held. They sat by the fire in silence, but it was a different kind of quiet now, an uneasy stillness that seemed to stretch between them. The boy glanced at the woodsman, who stared into the flames, lost in thought. His once familiar presence now felt distant, almost foreign. After a long while, the woodsman finally spoke. "That man who came to the cabin, he's not just a royal official. He's part of a group that's been waiting for you. They believe you're the key to finishing what your parents started. They think you can lead them." The boy's stomach twisted at the thought. Led a rebellion. How could he, a mute orphan with no knowledge of his heritage, possibly be what they were looking for? He had spent his entire life hiding, surviving, avoiding attention. The idea of stepping into such a role was not just terrifying, it felt impossible. The woodsman seemed to sense his fear. "I know it's not what you wanted. It's not what I wanted for you either. But the truth is, whether you like it or not, the kingdom is watching. If they find you, they'll either force you to lead this rebellion, or they'll kill you to stop it from ever happening." The boy felt a cold dread settle in his chest. The woodsman's words were harsh, but he knew they were true. He had no voice to protest, no way to argue against a role that others had already decided for him. All he could do was listen. "They'll come for you again," the woodsman continued, his voice hardening. "And when they do, you'll have to make a choice. Run for the rest of your life, or face them head-on." The boy looked at the woodsman, trying to read the emotion behind his words. The man who had raised him, who had taught him everything he knew, was now telling him that he had no choice but to fight. The weight of it was crushing. Before the boy could fully grasp what was happening, the sounds of distant footsteps echoed through the forest. The woodsman's face tightened, and he immediately stood, pulling the boy to his feet. "They found us." In an instant, the woodsman was packing up their camp, dousing the fire with water. The boy, though his heart raced, moved in silence, following the woodsman's lead. The forest, once a place of refuge, now felt like a trap, with dangers lurking in every shadow. They began to run, moving swiftly through the trees. The footsteps behind them grew louder, closer. The boy's pulse pounded in his ears, and for the first time, he felt the weight of the rebellion truly pressing down on him. He could run now, but for how long? The woodsman glanced back at him, urgency in his eyes. "It's time to decide." The trees blurred past them as the woodsman and the boy ran, the sound of footsteps growing ever closer. The boy's heart raced, but his mind was spinning even faster. Every word the woodsman had told him weighed heavily on his shoulders. His lineage, the rebellion, and the idea that his simple life in the forest was gone forever. The woodsman suddenly veered off the path and motioned for the boy to follow. They ducked behind a dense thicket, crouching low to avoid detection. The boy's breath came in short, quiet gasps as he listened to the sounds of pursuit fade into the distance. For the moment, they were safe. The woodsman's face was lined with tension as he peered through the branches, watching the path they had just fled from. After several minutes of silence, he finally relaxed, his shoulders dropping as he sat back on his heels. But the exhaustion in his eyes told the boy this was just a temporary reprieve. "We can't keep running forever," the woodsman said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "They're not going to stop." The boy watched him closely, sensing something more than just physical fatigue in the woodsman's voice. There was a deeper struggle going on, one that the boy had only just begun to understand. The man who had raised him, who had always seemed so strong, now looked vulnerable, as if the weight of the past was finally catching up to him. "I didn't want this for you," the woodsman continued, his voice thick with regret. "I never wanted you to be caught up in the rebellion. That's why I kept the truth from you for so long. I thought I could protect you." The boy felt a pang of guilt. He had trusted the woodsman completely, never questioning the life they lived. But now, as the truth unraveled, he wondered if things could have been different if he had known sooner. Would they have been more prepared? Or was it inevitable that the past would find them, no matter how far they tried to run? The woodsman rubbed a hand over his face, his expression conflicted. I know you don't understand everything yet, and I know I've kept you in the dark. But I'm telling you now, because we don't have much time. They're not going to stop hunting you. The boy nodded slowly, though a part of him wanted to shake his head in denial. He didn't want to believe that his life had suddenly become so dangerous, so filled with uncertainty. But the look in the woodsman's eyes told him the truth. There was no going back. As the boy processed the enormity of his situation, the woodsman shifted uncomfortably, glancing back toward the path. I should have told you everything from the beginning, he muttered, more to himself than to the boy. I should have prepared you. The boy placed a hand on the woodsman's arm, a silent gesture of understanding. Despite everything, he knew that the woodsman had done his best. He had raised the boy in the only way he knew how, by keeping him safe in the quiet isolation of the forest. But now that safety was gone, and they had no choice but to confront the dangers ahead, the woodsman sighed heavily and stood, brushing the dirt from his knees. We need to keep moving. We can't stay in one place for long. The boy followed without hesitation, the weight of their situation pressing down on him like never before. Every step they took was a step further from the life he had known, and every moment brought them closer to the unknown dangers that awaited them. The day stretched on as they traveled deeper into the forest, moving with caution and speed. The boy's legs ached, but he didn't complain. He knew the stakes were too high for rest or comfort. The woodsman led the way, his eyes scanning their surroundings for any signs of danger. As dusk fell, they finally stopped at the edge of a small clearing. The woodsman knelt down, checking their surroundings once more before signaling for the boy to sit. They had made good progress, but both of them knew they couldn't keep running indefinitely. The boy sat on a fallen log, his mind racing with questions that had been building since they left the cabin. Who were his parents really? Why had they started the rebellion? And what did it mean for him to be part of this royal bloodline? He didn't have the voice to ask these questions, but the woodsman seemed to sense his curiosity. They were good people, the woodsman said quietly, as if reading the boy's thoughts. Your parents. They believed in fighting for what was right. The king. He's not the man the kingdom thinks he is. He's cruel, corrupt, and dangerous. Your parents tried to stop him, but they were betrayed. The boy's chest tightened as he listened. He had never imagined that his parents had played such a significant role in the kingdom's history. The thought filled him with both pride and fear. The woodsman's gaze softened. They didn't want you to be part of this. That's why they sent you away, to protect you. They hoped you'd be able to live a life free from the chaos they were caught in. The boy looked down at his hands, feeling the weight of his parents' choices. He understood now why the woodsman had kept him hidden all these years. It wasn't just to protect him from danger. It was to protect him from the truth. But now that truth was out, and there was no escaping it. We could keep running, the woodsman said after a long pause, his voice thick with uncertainty. We could find a place far away from all this, somewhere they'd never find us. But he didn't finish the sentence, but the boy knew what he meant. Running wouldn't change the fact that the kingdom was crumbling under the king's rule. It wouldn't change the fact that people were suffering, and that the boy was connected to a legacy of resistance. The boy glanced up at the woodsman, his expression filled with determination. For the first time, he felt a spark of something new, an understanding of what was at stake. His silence wasn't just a barrier, it was a weapon. And now, it was time to decide how to use it. The woodsman met the boy's gaze, a flicker of pride in his eyes. You don't have to do this, he said, his voice quiet. You don't have to lead the rebellion, but if you want to, I'll be by your side. The boy's resolve solidified. He wasn't just running from his past anymore. He was running toward his future. And though the path ahead was filled with danger, he knew he couldn't turn back. He nodded firmly, signaling his decision. The woodsman's expression softened, and he placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. All right, he said with a faint smile. Let's see where this takes us. They gathered their belongings and moved forward into the night, the forest stretching out before them like the uncertain future that awaited. But for the first time, the boy felt ready to face whatever was coming. His silence, once a shield, had become a strength, and it was time to wield it. The darkness of the forest seemed to grow thicker as they pressed forward, the dense canopy overhead blocking out the light of the moon. The boy's legs ached, but he kept moving, the determination in his chest pushing him onward. Beside him, the woodsman remained alert, his hand hovering near the axe strapped to his belt. They were deep in the forest now, far from the cabin and the life they once knew. But danger was never far behind. As they made their way through the underbrush, the boy heard the faint sound of footsteps approaching from behind. His pulse quickened, and he glanced at the woodsman, who gave him a silent nod of acknowledgement. The boy's instincts told him they were being hunted. "We need to move faster," the woodsman whispered, his voice tense. The boy nodded, and they quickened their pace, weaving through the trees in an attempt to lose their pursuers. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and the boy could hear voices now. Soldiers, no doubt sent by the royal official who had come to the cabin. The woodsman led them off the path, moving deeper into the forest's wild heart. They sprinted through the thick undergrowth, branches scratching at their clothes and faces. The boy's breath came in sharp, ragged bursts, but he pushed through the exhaustion. He had no choice. The sound of pursuit grew louder. The boy's heart raced, and panic threatened to bubble up inside him, but he kept his focus on the woodsman ahead, trusting the older man to lead them to safety. Suddenly, the woodsman veered off the trail, pulling the boy with him. They dove into a narrow ravine, the earth soft and cool beneath them. The woodsman pressed a finger to his lips, signaling for silence, and the boy nodded, holding his breath as they crouched in the shadows. The soldiers' voices echoed through the trees as they neared the ravine, their footsteps crunching on the forest floor. The boy's heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment, he feared they would be discovered. But the soldiers passed by, oblivious to their hiding place. The boy exhaled slowly, relief washing over him, though he knew it was temporary. They couldn't stay hidden forever. As the footsteps faded, the woodsman gestured for the boy to follow, and they carefully climbed out of the ravine. Once they were back on their feet, the woodsman turned to the boy, his expression grave. "They won't stop until they find you. We need to keep moving." The boy nodded, though the weight of the pursuit pressed down on him like never before. He had always known the forest as a place of refuge, but now it felt like a prison, with danger lurking behind every tree. As they moved deeper into the forest, the boy's mind raced. He couldn't keep running forever. Eventually, they would have to face their pursuers, and when that time came, the boy would need to be ready. Hours passed as they traveled through the forest, the boy's legs feeling like lead beneath him. The pursuit seemed to have lessened for now, but neither he nor the woodsman dared to slow down. They knew it was only a matter of time before the soldiers regrouped. Just as dawn began to break, the woodsman suddenly stopped, raising a hand to signal the boy to halt. The boy froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He strained to listen, but all he could hear was the soft rustle of the wind through the trees. The woodsman's eyes narrowed, and before the boy could react, a group of figures emerged from the shadows. They were dressed in rough, worn clothes, their faces hidden beneath hoods. The boy's first instinct was to run, but the woodsman remained still, his hand resting on the axe at his belt. One of the figures stepped forward, pulling back his hood to reveal a weathered face and piercing eyes. "We've been waiting for you," he said, his voice low and measured. The boy's pulse quickened. These weren't soldiers. They were rebels. The woodsman relaxed slightly, but didn't release his grip on his weapon. "You're part of the rebellion," he said, his voice flat. The man nodded. "We've been following you for days." The boy. "He's the one we've been waiting for." The boy's stomach churned. Ever since he had learned the truth about his heritage, the weight of the rebellion had loomed over him like a shadow. Now, standing before the rebels who expected him to lead them, the reality of his situation hit him harder than ever. The rebel leader stepped closer, his eyes locking onto the boy. "Your parents were heroes," he said softly. They fought to free this kingdom, and now that burden falls to you. The people need someone to believe in, someone who can finish what they started. The boy shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to respond. He had never asked for this role, and the thought of leading a rebellion felt like an impossible task. He was just a boy, a mute orphan raised in the woods. How could he possibly be the leader these people needed? The woodsman glanced at the boy, his expression unreadable. "He's not ready for this," he said quietly, though there was a hint of doubt in his voice. The rebel leader's gaze didn't waver. "He doesn't have a choice. The kingdom is falling apart, and if we don't act soon, it will be too late." The boy felt the weight of the man's words settle heavily on his shoulders. He glanced at the woodsman, searching for some kind of reassurance, but the older man's face was etched with conflict. Before the boy could fully process what was happening, another figure stepped forward, a woman with sharp eyes and a confident stance. "You don't have to do this alone," she said, her voice firm but kind. "We're here to help you. We've been preparing for this moment for years." The boy looked at her, feeling the tension inside him ease slightly. There was something in her voice, something that made him feel less alone in all of this. The rebel leader extended a hand to the boy. "Come with us. We have a camp not far from here. We can keep you safe, and we can help you understand what you need to do." The boy hesitated for a moment, glancing at the woodsman. The older man's eyes were filled with uncertainty, but he gave the boy a small nod. With a deep breath, the boy stepped forward and took the rebel leader's hand. The rebel camp was hidden deep within the forest, nestled in a secluded valley that was nearly impossible to find without knowing the way. The boy followed the group, his steps hesitant as they wove through the dense trees and underbrush. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into a world he didn't belong to, a world of rebellion, danger, and responsibility he wasn't ready for. The camp itself was larger than the boy had expected. Tents were scattered throughout the clearing, with people milling about, tending to fires, sharpening weapons, and mending clothes. It was a stark contrast to the life of quiet solitude he had known in the woods. The boy's heart raced as he looked around, taking in the faces of the rebels, each one filled with a quiet determination that he couldn't yet understand. The rebel leader, whose name he had learned was Yarok, led him and the woodsman through the camp. "This is where we've been preparing," Yarok explained as they walked. "We've been waiting for you for a long time. Your parents' legacy lives on here." The boy's stomach twisted at the mention of his parents. He had only learned about them recently, but now their presence felt overwhelming, like a shadow he couldn't escape. As they reached the center of the camp, Yarok gestured for the boy to sit by the fire, while the woodsman stood nearby, watching the camp with cautious eyes. Yarok sat across from the boy, his gaze intense. "You don't know the full story, do you?" he asked, though it was clear he already knew the answer. The boy shook his head. Yarok sighed and leaned forward. "Your parents were more than just rebels. They were leaders, yes, but they were also symbols of hope. The people rallied behind them because they believed that your family could bring change. They were the heart of the rebellion, and when they fell, so did the movement." The boy stared at Yarok, the weight of his words pressing down on him. He had never imagined that his parents had played such a crucial role in the kingdom's history. He had always thought of them as a distant, unknown part of his past. But now, learning that they had been at the center of a revolution, that they had died fighting for something greater, made him feel more connected to them than ever before. Yarek's eyes softened. "Your mother, she was the strongest among us. She led with both wisdom and compassion, and she inspired loyalty in everyone who followed her. But when the king's forces betrayed us and attacked, she sacrificed herself to save you." The boy felt his chest tighten, a strange mix of pride and sorrow filling him. He hadn't known his mother, but hearing about her bravery stirred something inside him, a sense of responsibility he couldn't ignore. Yarok continued, his voice quiet but firm. "Your father was captured and executed shortly after. But before he died, he made sure you were sent into hiding. They believed you were the kingdom's last hope. Their sacrifice was meant to give you a chance to grow up, to one day return and finish what they started." The boy felt a lump form in his throat. He had spent his life in silence, hidden away in the woods, never knowing the full truth about who he was or where he came from. But now, sitting in this rebel camp, surrounded by people who believed in him because of a legacy he hadn't even known existed, he felt overwhelmed. He glanced at the woodsman, who stood silently nearby, his expression unreadable. The boy knew the woodsman had kept the truth from him for his own protection, but now that the truth was out, he wasn't sure what to do with it. Yarok leaned closer, his gaze piercing. "I know this is a lot to take in, but you need to understand, this isn't just about your past. It's about the future of the kingdom. The people are suffering under the king's rule, and they need someone to lead them. They need you." The boy's mind raced, his thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and doubt. He didn't know how to be a leader. He didn't know how to fight or inspire people. All he had ever known was the quiet life in the forest, where silence had been his only companion. But now, with the weight of his parents' legacy on his shoulders, he realized that silence was no longer an option. The camp was quiet as the boy sat by the fire, his mind still reeling from everything Yarok had told him. He felt the eyes of the rebels on him, their unspoken expectations heavy in the air. He had come here thinking he was just an orphan, raised in isolation, but now he knew he was the son of heroes, a symbol of hope for a rebellion that had been waiting for him to return. But the more he thought about it, the more unsettled he became. He wasn't ready for this. He wasn't a leader, and he didn't want to be one. The boy glanced over at the woodsman, who had kept his distance since their arrival at the camp. As night fell, the woodsman finally approached the boy, his expression dark and conflicted. He sat down beside him, the flickering fire casting shadows on his face. "There's something I need to tell you," the woodsman said quietly, his voice heavy with regret. "Something I should have told you a long time ago." The boy's stomach tightened. He had already learned so much in the past few days. Could there really be more? The woodsman took a deep breath, his eyes avoiding the boy's. "I wasn't just a woodsman when I found you. I was a soldier. I served the king." The boy's heart stopped. He stared at the woodsman, his mind struggling to comprehend what he had just heard. "I was part of the army that crushed the rebellion," the woodsman continued, his voice low and filled with guilt. "I didn't know who your parents were at the time. I was just following orders. But after the battle, I found you abandoned in the forest. I didn't know what to do, so I took you in." The boy felt the world tilt beneath him. The man who had raised him, who had taught him everything he knew, had been a part of the very army that had killed his parents. The woodsman's voice cracked as he spoke. "I didn't realize until later who you were, who your parents were. By then, it was too late. I had already grown to care for you. I thought I could make up for my past by raising you, by protecting you." The boy's chest tightened with a mixture of betrayal and confusion. He had trusted the woodsman completely, had seen him as a protector and a father figure. But now, knowing that the woodsman had been a part of the army that had destroyed his family, he didn't know how to feel. The woodsman looked at the boy, his eyes filled with regret. "I know you probably hate me now, and I don't blame you, but I need you to understand, I'm not that man anymore. I haven't been for a long time." The boy stared into the fire, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, sadness, betrayal. It all crashed over him like a tidal wave, leaving him feeling lost and alone. The woodsman reached out, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." For a long time, neither of them spoke. The boy's heart ached, and the silence between them felt heavier than ever. But in that silence, the boy realized something important. Despite the betrayal, despite the lies, the woodsman had raised him, had cared for him when no one else would. And in the end, that meant something. The boy looked up at the woodsman, his eyes filled with pain, but also a hint of understanding. He nodded slowly, letting the woodsman know that he had heard him. The betrayal still hurt, but the boy knew that the woodsman's actions in the past didn't erase the years of care and protection they had shared. The woodsman gave him a small, grateful smile. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. As the night deepened, the boy felt the weight of everything settle on his shoulders once again. His parents' legacy, the rebellion, the truth about the woodsman. It was all too much to process at once. But now, more than ever, he knew that the path ahead was his to choose. And whatever decision he made, he would have to face it on his own terms. The days in the rebel camp passed in a blur. The boy, though still overwhelmed by the weight of his heritage and the recent revelations, found himself slowly integrating into the rhythm of the camp. But even as he tried to adjust, the tension in the air was palpable. The kingdom was on the edge of collapse, and every day brought news of new atrocities committed by the king's forces. The rebels spoke in hushed voices about towns burned to the ground, people taken from their homes, and villages left to starve. The boy listened quietly, his heart heavy with each new story. He couldn't shake the feeling that the kingdom's suffering was somehow connected to him, that his silence had allowed these horrors to continue unchecked. Yarrick and the other leaders of the rebellion worked tirelessly to prepare their forces for the battles ahead, but they always seemed to return to the same point. They needed a symbol. They needed the boy to take his place as the leader they had been waiting for. One evening, as the boy sat alone by the fire, Yarrick approached him. The rebel leader's face was drawn with fatigue, but his eyes were sharp with determination. He sat down beside the boy, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames. "The people are waiting for you," Yarrick said quietly. "Every day, they're looking for a sign that there's hope, something, someone to rally behind." The boy didn't respond. He wasn't sure how to answer Yarrick's words, especially when he still felt so uncertain about his role in all of this. He wasn't a leader, wasn't even sure if he believed in the rebellion himself. Yarrick sighed, leaning back against the log. "I know you're scared. I know this is more than you ever wanted. But this isn't just about you. It's about everyone who's suffering under the king's rule. Every day that passes, more lives are lost. We can't wait much longer." The boy's chest tightened. He had heard the stories of the king's cruelty, had seen the desperation in the eyes of the rebels. But leading them, it felt like an impossible task. He wasn't his parents. He wasn't strong or brave. He was just a mute boy who had grown up in the woods, far away from the kingdom's troubles. But Yarrick's words echoed in his mind. "Every day, they're waiting for you." The boy looked into the fire, his thoughts swirling. He didn't have to speak to lead, he realized. His silence, once a barrier, could be something more. It could be a symbol, a sign of resilience and strength. His parents had fought for something greater than themselves, and now that legacy had fallen to him. He wasn't ready, but he wasn't sure he ever would be. Yarrick stood, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "I know this is hard," he said softly, "but I believe in you, and so do they." The boy looked up at Yarrick, the weight of his expectations heavy, but somehow less suffocating than before. He nodded, though doubts still lingered at the edges of his mind. As Yarrick walked away, the boy sat alone by the fire, staring into the flames. The kingdom was on the brink of collapse, and the rebels were waiting for him to take his place. The question was no longer if he would lead, but when. The air in the rebel camp crackled with tension as the day of the attack approached. The boy stood at the edge of the camp, watching as the rebels prepared for battle. They moved with a sense of purpose, their faces hard with determination. Weapons were sharpened, armor adjusted, and strategies discussed in hushed tones. The boy had agreed to be a part of the attack, though the decision weighed heavily on him. He still didn't feel ready, but there was no time left to hesitate. The capital, the heart of the kingdom, was where the rebellion needed to strike if they were to have any chance of success. And they had chosen him to be the one to lead the charge. Yarrick approached him, his expression grave but resolute. "The time has come," he said, his voice steady. "We move tonight." The boy nodded, though his stomach churned with anxiety. He had never been in a battle, never fought for anything other than survival. But now he was about to walk into the heart of the kingdom, into the lion's den, with the hopes of the entire rebellion resting on his shoulders. As the sun set, casting a blood-red glow over the forest, the rebels gathered at the edge of the camp. The boy stood among them, feeling the weight of their eyes on him. They looked to him not just as a leader, but as a symbol of hope. And though he still doubted himself, he knew he couldn't let them down. Yarrick stood beside him, his voice low but clear as he addressed the gathered rebels. "Tonight, we strike at the heart of the king's tyranny. Tonight, we fight for our freedom." The boy felt a shiver run down his spine as Yarok spoke, the tension in the air thick enough to cut. The rebels raised their weapons, their faces grim but determined. This was it. There was no turning back now. As the group began their march toward the capital, the boy moved silently among them, his mind racing with thoughts of what was to come. He had been trained for this moment, but nothing could prepare him for the reality of leading an attack against the king's forces. The capital loomed on the horizon, its high walls and towering gates casting long shadows over the landscape. The boy felt a knot form in his stomach as they approached. This was the heart of the kingdom, the place where his parents had fought and died. And now, he was here to finish what they had started. The plan was simple but dangerous. The rebels would strike under the cover of darkness, using the element of surprise to breach the gates and infiltrate the city. From there, they would make their way to the palace, where the king sat on his throne, secure in his power. The boy and Yarok led the way, their movements swift and silent as they approached the walls. The city was eerily quiet, the usual bustle of life replaced by a tense stillness that sent a chill down the boy's spine. With a signal from Yarok, the rebels sprang into action. They moved quickly, scaling the walls and slipping into the city like shadows. The boy's heart raced as they crept through the darkened streets, the palace looming in the distance. But as they neared the palace gates, the sound of soldiers' boots echoed through the streets. The king's forces were waiting. A battle erupted in the narrow streets, the clash of steel and the shouts of men filling the night air. The boy fought alongside the rebels, his movements swift and precise, as he dodged and struck with the skill he had learned in the forest. But even as the rebels pressed forward, the king's forces were relentless, and the boy knew that reaching the palace would be no easy feat. The rebels pushed through, their determination unshakable. But the closer they got to the palace, the more the boy felt the weight of the rebellion pressing down on him. His silence, once a refuge, now felt like a burden he could no longer bear. As the battle raged around him, the boy realized that this was his moment. This was what his parents had fought and died for. And now, it was up to him to carry their legacy forward. With a newfound resolve, the boy led the charge toward the palace gates, his heart pounding in his chest. The king's forces faltered under the rebel onslaught, and for the first time, victory seemed within reach. But as they reached the palace gates, the boy knew that the hardest battle was yet to come. The palace gates loomed ahead, massive and imposing, their dark iron glinting in the moonlight. The boy stood at the front of the rebel force, his heart pounding in his chest as the sounds of battle raged around him. The rebels had fought valiantly to reach this point, but the real test lay ahead. Yarok stood beside him, his face grim but determined. "This is it," he said quietly. "The king is inside. If we take the palace, we take the kingdom." The boy nodded, though a heavy weight settled in his chest. This was the moment he had been dreading, the moment when he would have to face the man responsible for the destruction of his family, the man who had ruled the kingdom with cruelty and fear. The rebels surged forward, breaking through the palace gates with a thunderous crash. The boy led them inside, his movements swift and deliberate as they flooded into the grand halls of the palace. The air inside was thick with tension, the walls lined with ornate tapestries and gilded decorations, a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding outside. As they moved deeper into the palace, the boy's mind raced. He knew that the king would be waiting for him, but he didn't know what he would find. Would the king be surrounded by his guards, ready for a final stand? Or would he be alone, desperate to hold on to his crumbling power? The rebels encountered resistance as they pressed forward, the king's guards fighting fiercely to defend the throne. But the boy moved through them with the precision and silence he had honed in the forest, his every step bringing him closer to the heart of the palace. At last, they reached the throne room. The massive doors stood before them, their intricate carvings a testament to the wealth and power of the man who sat inside. The boy's pulse quickened as Yarrick signaled to the rebels to take positions around the doors. Yarrick turned to the boy, his eyes hard but filled with something that almost resembled pride. "This is your fight now," he said. "The king is yours to face." The boy nodded, though his throat tightened with fear. This was what it had all come down to: the rebellion, his parents' sacrifice, the years spent hidden in the forest. It had all led to this moment. With a deep breath, the boy stepped forward and pushed open the doors to the throne room. The room was vast, its high ceilings and marble floors gleaming in the candlelight. At the far end of the room sat the king, draped in rich robes, his crown gleaming atop his head. He looked smaller than the boy had imagined, his face drawn with exhaustion and fear. But his eyes burned with defiance, as if he still believed he could hold onto his power. The boy stepped forward, his heart racing. He felt the weight of his parents' legacy pressing down on him, the echoes of their rebellion ringing in his ears. He had no words to say, only silence. The king stood slowly, his hands resting on the arms of his throne. "So, you're the boy," he said, his voice cold and calculating. "The one they think can defeat me." The boy didn't respond, his gaze locked on the king. The king chuckled darkly, though there was a tremor in his voice. "You think you can lead this rebellion? You're just a child. Mute, no less. Do you really believe you're fit to challenge the king?" The boy's chest tightened with anger, but he remained silent, his eyes never leaving the king's. The king's expression darkened. "You're nothing," he spat. "Your parents were fools, and now they're dead. You'll join them soon enough." With those words, the king drew a sword from beneath his robes, the steel gleaming in the dim light. The boy's pulse raced as the king stepped down from the throne, his eyes filled with rage. The final confrontation had begun. The boy's movements were quick, fluid, and silent as he dodged the king's strikes, the sword whistling through the air. The king, though clearly older and weaker than he once was, fought with a vicious desperation. Each strike was filled with a feral intensity, as though he were trying to hold onto not just his throne, but his very life. The boy moved with the grace and precision he had learned from years in the forest, his silence allowing him to outmaneuver the king at every turn. But even as he gained the upper hand, the weight of the moment bore down on him. This was the man who had destroyed his family, the man who had plunged the kingdom into despair. And now, it was up to the boy to end it. With a swift, decisive movement, the boy disarmed the king, sending his sword clattering to the floor. The king fell to his knees, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he stared up at the boy with wide, terrified eyes. The boy stood over him, his heart pounding in his chest. He had won. The king was defeated. But as he looked down at the man who had caused so much suffering, he felt a strange emptiness settle over him. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment of victory. But it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like the end of something he had never asked to begin. The king's voice trembled as he spoke. "Kill me," he whispered. "Finish what your parents started." The boy stared at him, his chest tight with conflicting emotions. He had fought so hard to reach this point, but now that he was here, he didn't know what to do. The rebels gathered around the room, their eyes fixed on the boy, waiting for him to make the final decision. This was his moment, his choice. The boy glanced at Yarrick, who nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. The rebels were ready to follow his lead, whatever it may be. With a deep breath, the boy looked down at the king one last time. And then, in a moment of clarity, he turned away. The boy's decision to spare the king rippled through the throne room like a wave. The rebels stood in stunned silence, their eyes wide with disbelief. The king, still on his knees, looked up at the boy with a mixture of fear and confusion. He had expected death. He had expected an end to his reign of terror. But the boy had chosen a different path. Yarrick stepped forward, his face a mask of shock, though there was a glimmer of understanding in his eyes. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, his voice low. "Are you sure?" The boy nodded, his gaze never leaving the king. He had made his choice, and he knew it was the right one. Killing the king wouldn't change the past. It wouldn't bring back his parents or undo the suffering of the kingdom. But sparing him, choosing mercy, was a step towards something greater. The boy's silence, once a shield and a burden, had become a symbol of strength and resilience. He didn't need to speak to make his point. His actions were enough. The rebels moved swiftly to take the king into custody, binding his hands and leading him from the throne room. The boy watched in silence as the man who had ruled the kingdom with cruelty and fear was led away, powerless for the first time in his life. As the king disappeared from sight, the boy felt a strange sense of relief wash over him. The rebellion was over, but the real work had just begun. The kingdom was broken, and it would take time, perhaps years, to rebuild it. But for the first time in his life, the boy felt a sense of hope. Yarrick approached him again, his expression softer now. "You did the right thing," he said quietly. "Mercy is harder than revenge, but it's the first step toward real change." The boy nodded, though the weight of everything still pressed down on him. He had won, but the cost had been great. His parents were gone, and the kingdom was in ruins. But now, at least, there was a chance for a better future. The rebels gathered around the boy, their faces filled with admiration and respect. They didn't need words to express what they felt. The boy had become the leader they had hoped for, not through violence, but through quiet strength. As the sun rose over the kingdom, casting a warm glow over the palace, the boy stood at the edge of the throne room, looking out at the horizon. The future was uncertain, but it was his to shape. The boy's silence had spoken louder than words ever could. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. It really helps the channel grow and brings more stories like this your way. Let us know in the comments. What moment in this story had the most impact on you? Was it the final confrontation? The unexpected twist? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a story idea you'd like to see brought to life? Drop your suggestions in the comments. Whether it's a thrilling adventure, a mysterious tale, or a heartwarming drama, your ideas could inspire the next story on the channel. Thank you for being part of our community. Your support means the world.